Hello, welcome back. Welcome back. So, today we're going to be working on the pendant that we started last week, and we're going to be working on the pendant itself, and we'll be working on the bail and the bail mechanism that we started last week. So let's take a look at where we left off. And try a different light here. Yeah, it's a little bit better, not much. So here's the pendant that where we left off last week. And you can see that I've taken an additional sheet of silver. It's another 1.5 millimeter thick piece of silver. And we soldered that to the back of the pendant. So now that we have the body of the piece roughed out, we can continue to cut out the border and remove all this excess material, and then clean up the edges all the way around and prepare that for connecting the bail mechanism and ultimately the bail itself. And it'll be a little shorter than that, so it'll probably look like that, about like that, with the squares accent pieces on either side. So you can see we shaped and formed these last time, and I went ahead and soldered them. I soldered those joints. And today what we're going to do is we're going to square it out, smooth off the sides, file and sand the sides off to square it up and make that a little bit more finished than it is right now. So I'm going to start with the plate itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the saw frame, and we're going to cut around this border. You know, that's not the best. See if I can bring that down a little bit. Okay, that's a little bit better. It just doesn't seem to make any difference, huh? So what we're going to do is we're going to cut around this border and remove all this excess material around the edge. And we did some of the sawing last time when we cut out the design in the top plate. And we're going to do basically the same thing today. And then we'll come back and we'll file away all this excess material. So let me grab my saw frame, and we can begin to saw this material away. And again, when you're sawing out and just removing material, you can go relatively quickly, but again, you don't want to go too fast and remove too much material. And then you would have to try to replace that, and that's just not going to be realistic to try to do. So I'm just going to cut a little bit shy of where the edge of the design is, and then we'll use a file, use a relatively rough file to remove the bulk of the excess. I can see better with this up. All right, so get our saw frame back in. Alright, and we'll repeat that on the other side. I'm going to turn this light back on. Makes it just a little bit easier for me to see. So now that we've removed the largest of the excess, we can come back with our file and begin to remove the rest of the excess as we get closer to that join along this edge. So as you're filing, you want to periodically look at the piece a little closer so that you don't go too far and remove the design that you have on top. And by holding the file flat to the face of the piece, you should be able to kind of watch it as it removes material and gets closer to the final design shape. Let's go just a little bit more on this side. And again, when filing, unless you're trying to remove a lot of material very quickly, it's best to make shorter strokes and remove just little bits at a time. And most files will cut in one direction. So that's when you want to apply the pressure. The pressure is when you're in the cutting, on that cutting stroke. Drawing it back across the piece, you can hear how it kind of just rides across the metal. It doesn't really make any kind of cutting sound because it's going against the teeth. And there's no need at that point to apply any pressure against the piece with the file because it's not cutting, and you're just letting it ride back against the piece during that non-cutting stroke. So there we have it, pretty close to, you can just see that little white line across there, and what that is that's just the light reflecting down on that little bit of material that's left on the bottom plate, sticking up just a little bit. So I'm going to stop at that point with this file and continue around removing material closer to the design in preparation for the next step, which will be using a finer file, a less coarse file, and taking it down that 1/4 of a millimeter, maybe 1/2 of a millimeter left until we're right on the edge of that design. And again, we talked about using the bench pin in the past, and holding the piece against the bench pin, and then moving your file against it. Some people like to use the inside edge of the bench pin, and that gives them, if they're trying to cut a piece that's pretty delicate, it gives you a little bit more support than if the piece is just hanging off of the edge of the bench pin. Some people like to file with the piece flat on the bench pin or at their filing angle, and one side of the file is smooth, the other side is rough, and you place that smooth side down against the bench pin, and you can draw the file forward. Some people like to use the edge. Depends on the size of the piece for me, that dictates where on the bench pin I'm going to work. The smaller it is, the closer to the center I like to use it. You can hold the piece a lot easier when it's small. A larger piece you can hang off of the edge, and you can even then come back and clamp the piece down if you have small clamps. And I've got a few different types of clamps. I tend to use these little brass clamps, and I have them modified so that you can use them on the bench pin in this manner. The bottom piece has a piece of steel spike that's embedded in the lower jaw, and that allows the piece to bite into the bench pin wherever I want to place it, because as you know, the back of the bench pin is tapered, so it would be difficult for a vise to grip flat if the opposite side is at an angle. And these kind of clamps come in handy when you have sometimes a longer piece. They work better on. You have more room to move your saw frame as you're coming in and trying to cut. Filing is a lot more difficult if what you're using is your larger file. But if you're using one of your small needle files, or in some cases a small escapement file, having the piece clamped can allow you to get in and work on small areas and have the stability that you want to have without getting your fingers in too close on a small piece. So clamps can come in real handy in working on the bench pin if they're set, if they're the type of clamp that is small enough that you can get into those tight areas and clamp your piece. Well, with this large of a pendant, particularly this part of the pendant that we're working on, it's easier for me to just get in and do the filing freehand, as it were, and still be able to get the material removed in a controlled manner. Sometimes it's easy to have the file tilt at an angle when you're trying to do a long straight stroke, and you can end up filing your piece at the wrong angle and removing more material than you want to. So there we have the two sides filed away, and we're just going to continue around and remove more of this. rough cut from the saw frame, taking small passes with the file and trying to keep it parallel to the bench pin, which gives us a nice 45-degree or 90-degree angle on that filed section. So as you can see, as you turn this in the light, you can see the reflection off of the filed section with the small little crosscut section in the center where the jaws of the saw frame left, or the saw blade left a little bit of witness mark here that we haven't filed past yet. But you can see by turning it in the light that it gives you the reflection, so it's easier to see the difference between the two finished edges. And as we advance this cut with the file further, eventually we'll get down to where we'll begin to witness on the top plate, the file's marks as we draw the file forward. And then we'll know that we're at that flush joint. But we'll do those final passes with the file with a much finer file, so that we remove very small bits of metal as we approach the edge of that top plate, and begin to do the last cuts with the file on this pendant. And that'll be it as far as hand filing. We'll do some more finishing with sandpaper sticks to further refine the metal, and prepare it a little bit more for pre-polishing. A lot of material. And I might have been better off using the saw frame at that stage, or at this stage on this edge, because we've got a lot more material on this final edge here than we left on the other pieces where we sawed it. This was the finished edge of the bottom plate off of this edge here. So there was no need to have a lot hanging over the edge or, overlapping. But you do want to leave a fairly good amount, at least a millimeter, around the edge. Oftentimes when you're soldering something flat onto another flat, the top piece can have a tendency to float around once the solder goes liquid during the soldering stage. And I have had pieces that have lifted up and floated on the solder enough that the top piece could move. And then once that hardens up, it's where it's going to be. Now you can try and come back and reheat the piece to get the solder to flow, but then you're left with trying to move that top plate in that hot form, and you can't touch it with your fingers. And trying to reposition it with one hand and one tool, whether it's a solder pick or tweezers, is difficult at best. It's often better to have to just remove the pieces, heat the solder till it flows, separate the parts, come in and refinish that face and file down through the solder that remains, and start over than it is to try and move it while you're heating it. But either way, if done correctly, you'll have a little bit of material left to have to remove. And as you saw when we started today, we used the saw frame to remove the two sides that had the most material hanging over, and the file to remove that one, or to clean up the one side and this side here. So that's why I said I might have been better off removing the bulk of this material with the saw frame, but we're already into it, so we might as well. And one of the advantages of having your bench pin cut with different angles and different dimensions is you can reposition the piece as you need to get in and remove the material from the area that you want to remove it. Doing a long section like this, I said, it's sometimes it's easier to have it on the side, but as you see here, when it's laying on the bench pin, if I only wanted to remove one corner, or I had a high spot in the center that I wanted to get out, being able to reposition it on the bench pin can be beneficial. But until we get all this material removed, we're going to be filing forever. So and now you can see as we move the piece in the light, we're very close to that cut edge now of the top piece. And so we can begin to use a finer cut file and further remove material until we're right at the edge of this pendant. Let me try this. Just going to clean up the high side of here. We still have so now I have a finer cut file, and this is a cross cut file as well, but it's a bit finer, and you can actually hear the difference in the sound that it makes moving across the metal. It's making a much it makes a much different sound than the more aggressive file that we were just using. Now we're just starting to come into contact with that top plate. And don't know if you can see it very well, but the file's beginning to cut not only the bottom plate, but it's beginning to run just across the edge of the top plate. And as we continue with that cut, you should be able to see the witness of the file marks across that top plate within a few more passes. We're pretty close right now. There we go. So now we've basically got the witness of the file marks across both surfaces, the top plate of both sides of the top plate and the bottom plate. And we're just going to take a couple more small passes to get down to the edge of where the solder met or joined the two pieces. It left a little concave section between the two metals, and you want to file down through that joint before you come back to try and polish the piece. So that side is now done with this file, and we'll continue around all four sides of the pendant, and then come back with slightly less aggressive grits of sandpaper until we get a smoothed, pre-polished finish in preparation for polishing. But the filing is pretty straightforward, as you can see. First, using the files to remove the bulk of the material that you want removed, and then coming back with a finer file to remove the deeper scratches or the deeper cuts that the more aggressive file make. And that way you can save a lot of time instead of trying to use, say, a sandpaper stick with like a 320 grit, which would take a long time to try and remove that material as quickly as a file would. But as with any tool that is designed for cutting, you really want to try to develop having a soft hand or a soft touch as you're filing, so you don't end up over-cutting the material with the more aggressive file that you would need to remove a lot of material. And so as you become more and more familiar with using the files, you'll begin to have a feel for when the teeth are cutting and when they're not, so that you can hold the piece with a light grip. You don't have to have a death grip on the piece to try to hold it still. You're balancing really the pressure of your fingers against the piece and the force of the file against the side of the piece. You're kind of balancing those two off of each other. And as the teeth are biting, you can feel when it really has a strong bite, and you can kind of lessen the force of the file against the piece so that it doesn't cut in as deeply, which will then make the piece want to flop around under your fingers, unless, like I said, you had a death grip on there. But it's kind of a give and take between your two hands, and the lighter feel you have, the lighter touch you have, the less likely that you will end up filing away material you don't want to file away, or just tiring your fingers out to such a point that you can't hold the piece against the bench pin anymore. But like I said earlier, you can use clamps if you're set up for it, if the piece is large enough for clamps. But when you're trying to file a long flat surface like this, having clamps, at least that clamp from this side, you could come back if you had a large enough clamp from the opposite side and clamp across the bench pin, and that would help if you have difficulty holding the piece while you're filing. But really, it's a matter of personal preference when it comes to that, and kind of developing your feel for the material. And the one thing with one of the things in having a bench set up for yourself while you're working on jewelry is it allows you to position your hands where they need to be, which is basically about chest high in front of you. Some people like to be about eye height or face height on their bench pin. But for me, that means I have to raise my arms even higher than I'm used to. So I like to have the piece about chest high and about 10-12 inches away from my chest, which allows me to just turn my head and tilt my head down a little bit so I'm not hunched over. The bench which would get very tiresome, especially if you're sitting, for hours at the bench. They also have setups where you can have stabilizers. Wood this originally was designed for, and right now I'm just using 2 ring mandrels, and that allows you to rest your arms or your elbows at the height they need to be for you to get in and hold the piece against the bench pin. I've worked at watchmakers' benches that don't have a bench pin, and I've worked at tables, and I've had other setups where I was just setting up the best I could with what I had, and I found that having a bench pin to do your work on, whether it's the type that you can clamp onto just a regular table, or the type that mount to the table, like I have here, or with the GRS setup, which has a steel plate on the front of the bench, or on the face of the bench, that allows me to interchange different tools to the bench pin. Some benches are set up that they just have an opening for the bench pin to slide into, and then you mount it to the bench. But either of those or any of those are helpful. And when you're first getting set up, a lot of times you won't have an actual jeweler's bench that has all of these mechanisms or devices already built into them. And you can buy a relatively inexpensive bench pin and clamp that will clamp onto the face of any table. The trick then is to have it high enough so that you can work relatively comfortably. And it was Donnie. And so that will help you by raising the work surface up than what would be normally the case in a regular table, where you have your work surface being at about just slightly above waist level. Trying to work on small pieces of jewelry at that height is just very difficult to do. So having the bench pin set up at a height that's more comfortable or more natural is very beneficial, very helpful. So let me pause here for a second, and I will be right back. Hey Donnie, what's up, man? Oh, okay. Oh yeah, yeah. No, I'm streaming Nash. I went on at 4. Yeah, so no worries. I just stepped away for a break. But anyways, I'll talk. Cool, man. All right, man. Bye. So I just realized. So my mic was on through that phone call with Donnie, so you guys got to hear all that. That was unfortunate. I thought I had muted it in Streamlabs, but I guess I didn't. So anyways, so where were we? We're talking about bench pins and using a bench pin. Hey, Donnie. Donnie just joined us in chat. So we're talking about bench pins and the aid that tool provides when you're sitting working on your jewelry. And let's switch back to our bench pin view. And so having that bench pin at a good working height is going to make all the difference particularly when you're working on really small pieces, even smaller than this. Having the bench pin to be able to position and hold and brace the part against is invaluable. Now there are other tools, whether it's a ring vise or an engraver's ball, that you can work on that raises the piece up a little bit. But we can talk about the benefits of those tools and the use of those tools on another day. Today, let's focus on the bench pin. So now we've prepped the pendant on 3 sides, and I've brought the two surfaces, the surface of the top plate and the surface of the bottom plate, down to a consistent level on 3 of the sides with the file. Now, don't know if you can see very well with this, but right here in this section right here, you can see just a little bit of a white line. So that's just a slight difference in the levels between the top plate here and the bottom plate. The bottom plate sticks up just a little bit higher on this side than it does on this side. And that line that you can see by rotating the piece in the light tells you that they're not perfectly flush. Now, if you follow that back into this section, it's gone, right? The line that separated those 2 pieces, the top plate and the bottom plate, is gone. But it's still here, just a slight piece slight bit of it. And on this piece, you can see just on this far end a little bit. And we'll come back and remove that with some of the sandpaper. But I wanted you to see how moving the piece in the light as you're working on it allows you to see those slight variations in the surface, in the surface condition of the material, that will aid you when you're looking at, okay, how much more material do I need to remove on one side as opposed to the other, and then you can adjust your cut, the pressure of your cut. So right now I've got my finger laid alongside the file, and I use this finger to tilt the file forward or backward and apply pressure across that face. And I can alter, I can adjust the angle of that file by very small amounts, by just applying a little bit more pressure in one direction than the other. And then we go back to what we were talking about earlier about having a light touch to begin with. So I'm not holding the piece down with, excessive force, or enough force that if I came back and I pushed really hard, it wouldn't move. I want to hold it flat to the surface with just enough force so that it doesn't move easily. And what I mean by easily is just, a small flick of the finger doesn't move it. If I put pressure against it, I can move it. But I want to have a light touch, an easy touch. Just enough force to hold it in place. Then when I bring the file against it, I'm putting the pressure just enough to keep the file at the angle and going in the direction that I want it to go. And I can make slight adjustments by applying more or less pressure against the face of the file with my finger, as I feel I need to be able to steer that file as it's cutting. And it's good to, if you have some old scrap metal, or whether it's brass because it's soft, copper's another soft metal. Aluminum's relatively soft, so that's, if you don't have brass or copper, you can use some pieces of aluminum if you have something thick enough. I'm not talking like a pop can or something like that. It's way too thin. But you want something relatively thick, 2, 3, 4 millimeters thick, so that it doesn't bend easily. And practice holding the piece against the bench pin, and practice bringing your file against the piece and applying just enough pressure to get it to begin to cut, and then get a feel for whether it's straight up and down, or if it's side to side, or if it's canted at a slight angle as you're cutting. And by making a small pass, looking at the piece, go back, make another pass, look at the piece, see what the witness what the tool is doing to the metal, by looking at it. And then making slight adjustments, making another cut, looking at the piece, and practicing that. And you'll begin to get a feel for how much pressure is needed to be applied to get it to cut, to remove the material, but not so much pressure that you lose control of the piece. You can't keep it clamped without putting a lot of forces. You're really going to tire your fingers out. And if you're working at the bench, you're not going to be able to do that for 8 hours. Now, what we're doing here, because we're not working in a commercial environment, we're not constrained by time. And what I mean by that is, obviously, if your job is to work at the bench, then you have to produce enough in an hour's time to justify the cost of that bench and to pay for the tools and the rental of the space and the justification of having a jeweler on staff. You've got to produce X amount of pieces on a daily basis to produce X amount of dollars. So what you do as a bench jeweler is you learn tricks to be able to speed things up, and some of that has to do with using the right tools. Some of that has to do with experience. Some of it you can learn by asking other jewelers. Some of it you kind of have to learn by doing it yourself and figuring it out. But be that as it may, when you're doing mass production or you're doing commercial production, whether it's as a bench jeweler in a jewelry store or working in a manufacturing environment, say doing mass production of jewelry, where you're going through 200, 300, 400 pieces in a day, obviously you're not doing each piece from start to finish from the ground up. But what you'd end up doing is doing parts in batches. So you'll cast, 50 to 75 pieces at one time. And you'll cut them all off at the same time. And then you'll file all the shanks to remove the sprues at the same time. And then you'll pre-finish them all at the same time. And you'll do them as in batches so that you can produce enough on a daily basis to be able to do that and make a living at it. The luxury of doing this, say in your off time, either as a hobby or you could even do it professionally, is you have the time to spend, and you're not constrained by the clock as you would be in a commercial environment. So spending the time to learn new techniques or to refine the techniques that you already have in a non-stressed environment really goes a long way to helping you build your skill set, your experience, and your confidence, so that if it was something that you wanted to do for a living, you could do that and be able to handle that environment. Because trust me when I tell you, working in a production environment or even just a commercial environment has its challenges, not the least of which is time. You could work in a retail store and the salespeople, the store management will come to you and they'll want you to be able to meet the expectations of the customer, and the customer may have the expectation that they're going to pick out a ring and pick out a stone, and you're going to set the stone and size the ring and finish it, all while they wait. Now, obviously, they're not going to want to sit and wait for a long time, so the pressure then from sales and management is to get the piece done. Now, obviously, you don't want to rush it. You don't want to cut any corners. You want to do the best work that is possible. So you learn pretty quickly how to adapt your approach or your technique to be able to enable you to be able to do that in a timely manner. And some jewelry stores have a walled or a glassed off area where the customers can watch as the jeweler does his work. So basically, they're just right on the other side of the glass, and that is, and it's a bit unsettling at first if you've never been in the public eye, to go and sit at a bench in front of people watching you, particularly if it's not your bench, if it's an unfamiliar bench. You don't know where they put the tools, or you hope they have the tools that you're going to need for one, but you don't know where they are, and so you're fumbling around looking for the tools and trying to use an unfamiliar bench, and you've got, a customer that's watching you from the other side of the glass, and they're getting ready to spend a lot of money in some cases. So you don't want to project an image that you don't know what you're doing. It's going to make them feel very uncomfortable. So practicing, particularly in your off hours, at your own pace, practicing your technique, learning the proper ways to handle a tool or what tool to use for what task, and doing that in a stress-free environment can go a long way to giving you the experience that you'll need if you want to make jewelry for a living. So now we have the pendant cut out on all four corners, roughed out, and I want to we'll go through finishing one side together, and then I'll finish the rest off stream. But what I've got here is I've got different grits of sandpaper, and this is all aluminum oxide sandpaper. Aluminum oxide is one of the minerals used in commercial sandpapers. And for those that know, and for those that don't know, it's also what sapphires are composed of, aluminum oxide. And basically, that's where sandpaper first came from, was crushed up and milled corundum, which is the scientific name for sapphire. It's an aluminum oxide. And it works really well for cutting metals because of its hardness. And those that are familiar with the hardness scale, it goes from 1 to 10. 1 being, I think, talc. Is a natural element, right? So it's a rock, basically. And talc is so it's like soapstone. Well, soapstone is actually harder than talc, but is like a 1. And diamond is a 10 at the opposite end of the scale. So obviously making sandpaper out of something soft isn't going to be that productive or that useful if you're trying to grind or sand something that's relatively hard. So corundum, aluminum oxide, sapphire, is 9 on a scale of 1 to 10. You can use diamond, and you can find diamond sanding abrasives, mediums, whether it's files that are embedded with diamond or paper, cloth material that, or a cloth-like material that's impregnated with diamond. But aluminum oxide works fine, and that's your most common sandpaper. So I usually start with about 400 grit, and then I'll go 400, 800, and 1200 in sandpaper sticks. And here I've just taken usually what I'll do is I'll just get the stir sticks that you can get at any hardware store for paint. I'll grab 4 or 5 of those sticks when I'm at the hardware store, and then wrap the sandpaper around those sticks, and it makes it very easy to handle. It's very much like using a file. So I'll have 4 or 5 of those in different grits, and some of them with different abrasive material for filing. So now I'm going to come back and I'm going to sand one of these edges and see if I can show you the difference between the side that has the file marks, right? And you can kind of see those little striations across the face of the silver. Let me see if I can get that any better into the, if that's going to focus. So you can see the light is kind of broken up across that surface. And then if I shift over to the side that I just sanded, it's actually a more muted, buffed kind of satin finish, because the scratch marks are much smaller, right, than the teeth of the file would leave. And so you'll use these sandpaper sticks in this fashion to remove more and more and more of those original witness marks of the file, scratches for lack of a better way to describe them. And the sandpaper will make finer and finer scratches. And as we talked about in one of our previous videos, I'll sand the piece in 2 different directions, so that once I make that first pass in one direction, all of the scratches will be in that direction, unless there's something deeper. And that will be obvious when all of the scratches go in one direction, that you've got one going the other direction. So I'll sand it with the sandpaper all in one direction until it looks to be pretty smooth. Then what I'll do is I'll change the direction of my sanding, and I'll sand it again, thus making all the scratches change direction. And if I see some that don't, see right up here, you see there's a couple scratches that are going the opposite direction than I was just sanding. So I was sanding in this direction, and those scratches go the other direction. So I know then that I need to go a little more, right? I need to file a little bit more material away so that I get all of those deeper scratches out. And so what I'm doing is that I'm prepping this for the next phase of sanding, where I use an even finer sandpaper. But if you've got a deeper scratch than this sandpaper was removed, and you go to a finer one, well, it's not going to remove it either. So you're going to go through all that and still have those deep scratches that need to be out. And you've got to start then with a rougher grit sandpaper and start over. So by switching directions when you're filing or when you're sanding, you can see that very clearly when you run across that. So once I know that all the deep scratches from the previous step have been removed, I can then move down in coarseness in my sandpaper stick, and then do again the same thing. I'll sand through those previous scratches all in one direction with the next sandpaper stick, and then I'll change the direction and see if I can witness deeper scratches that I missed in that last pass. And see, now all of the scratches that I just put in with this finer sandpaper are all going one direction. So I know that all the deeper scratches have been removed. So normally what we would do is we would have used that first sandpaper and done all 4 corners all the way around. And then the next grit. and do all four corners all the way around. But since we're only doing one side, I'm going through each step without finishing those other sides, because I want to show you how that looks when you get to the pre-polish stage. So now I'm using about a 1200 grit sandpaper, and I'm, just like last time, I'm filing all in one direction so that I can see if there are any scratches. And you can see just down on this end that it's just not square completely, and there's a little bit of a difference in the surface condition, right, from the rest of the sanding that I'm doing. And that tells me I need to go a little bit deeper, right? Make a few more passes to do that. And now that's gone. So now I'll excuse me, change the direction and sand down through the scratches that we just put in with this sandpaper in one direction, and change the direction of the scratches. And that way you can avoid having to go through all of those steps of sanding and then going back and looking a little closer and seeing that there were deeper cuts that you missed, deeper scratches that you missed, and now you've got to start all over again. So we've got those down to pretty fine. And I've got a 2500 that I use not as frequently on smaller pieces. This was mainly set up for finishing platinum rings in flat surfaces on the platinum rings. And there we go. But I want to see what kind of a finish it's going to give us on this silver, which is not anywhere near as dense as platinum. So it should take a nice finish pretty quickly, as opposed to platinum, which takes many more steps to get to a polish, even a pre-polish. Many more steps with platinum because of its density. Yeah, see, we've got almost every single previous scratch now out of that surface. The goal being, well, with a high polish piece, obviously, not with a satin finish piece or a piece that has a textured surface. But in a high polish piece, the goal is to have it as close to a mirror finish as can be, which means with the naked eye and even to some degree of magnification, you won't see any scratches. All you'll see is a smooth surface. Now, we know from science class, if we were paying attention when we were kids, that under enough magnification, you'll see plenty of scratches. But under the naked eye, and even say 10 to 20x, you want to see a mirror finish on silver, and white gold too as well, and platinum if it's supposed to have a high polish finish. And the only way that you can achieve that mirror finish on metal is to remove greater and greater degree, more and more and more of the scratches that are left by the tools that you use to try and polish it with. Every tool, if it's a useful tool, is designed to do, in this case, remove metal. And the goal is to use, then what I've got some now is I've got some sanding cloth that go all the way down to, I think I've got down to 2 micron. And these I use for pre-polishing pieces before we go to the buffing wheel, or use the flex shaft and use bobbing compound to pre-polish the piece in preparation for final polish. And what these abrasives will do is they'll take those filed and sandpapered finishes down to an almost mirror finish. And so let's just say, for example, there's where we were when we stopped using the sandpaper. So this is the surface finish that you would expect to see in metal that you have used a pretty fine sandpaper on. And then as I rotate the piece, you could see how the light, now you could just, it's just picking up some very faint scratches in the surface. But if you've got it turned at the right angle, you're starting to get a mirror finish. You're starting to see reflection in that metal of, anything above it. In this case, you can see my finger being reflected in the surface of that silver. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I've got 4 different grits of this sanding cloth that are finer and finer and finer. So even though we're beginning to see a mirror finish, I can still, under magnification, I can still see scratches in the surface. So again, what I'm doing is I'm sanding in one direction, then looking at the piece to see if I can see any scratches that go the other direction. And if I do, that means I need to keep polishing and sanding until I can't see any scratches going in the other direction. And once I do that, then I change the angle of the piece, and I do it again with that same abrasion that same abrasive stick that I just used, and I want to remove all the scratches going in the opposite direction. And then that will tell me that piece is as flat as I can make it with this stick. And I've removed all the scratches from the previous step, and now I can go to the next grit of abrasive. And so one of the benefits of having this sandpaper or this sanding medium mounted on a sanding stick is that, there's my little scissors there, is that as you progress using the piece, you can just remove that previous layer that you've worn out, basically, and expose a new section ready for sanding. And a lot of times, particularly with the sanding medium that is designed to make a mirror finish, I will expose a new section of clean sanding cloth when I change pieces. And the reason I'll do that is not all metals are the same. Even in, let's say you have 5 white gold pieces, and the type of alloys may have been different from one piece to the next. And you can pick up bits of that fine dust that are now embedded into the sandpaper. And that will actually transfer scratches because of the harder metal that's embedded in that paper onto the piece that you're trying to polish. So by exposing a new clean section of sandpaper cloth, I don't have as much risk of scratching this piece that I just tried to make mirror finished with a piece of metal, a hard piece of little metal that's embedded into the sandpaper. So that's one of the benefits of having these sticks mounted up, and use those to polish your pieces, is you can just peel off a layer and expose a nice clean section, and not risk scratching your piece. On an edge like this, it's a little harder to see those scratches because they are very, very small. And then once we go to the pre-polish on the buffing wheel and then the final polish, you won't be able to see those with the naked eye, or you won't even be able to see them under most magnification. But when you're doing a large flat section like this, and you're trying to make that be mirror finished, any scratches that are left are going to stand out like a sore thumb on a big flat surface like that. Now, naturally, in wearing a piece, they're going to get scratched up over time. But on a finished piece of jewelry, that's called patina. That gives it character. You've been wearing the piece. You've been loving it. It's a jewel now, where before it was just a shiny piece of metal. But when you're doing a piece for a customer and you want it presented in its best light, and it's supposed to be high polish, you don't want to see any scratches. So you want to make sure that you use each successive grit of abrasive and eliminate any of the scratches left by the previous tool, and not impart any new scratches by being careless or trying to reuse a piece of sandpaper, say, that you used in working on some platinum pieces. Now the platinum will scratch the silver. It will scratch the surface, and golds will of a lower carat. Whether it's a 10 carat piece you were working on, or even in some cases a 6 or 8 carat, and you're working on an 18 karat gold piece or a 22 karat gold piece, it's going to scratch. That lower carated gold is going to scratch the softer or higher carated gold. So it's good to kind of get into the habit of cleaning off your tools after you're done working with them, either between pieces if you have enough time, and if not, at least once a day at the end of a shift or before you begin working, removing that used layer of sandpaper off of your sandpaper sticks, using the file card on your files to get metal out of the teeth of your files, and sweeping up your bench tray or your work surface to pick up any little pieces of metal that you would pick up while you're handling your tools in your bench. It's good to be in the habit of doing that as you go, because especially if you're working in a commercial environment, where you're working on, say, you've got 30 or 40 pieces sitting on the top of your bench, and you've just sized them all, and you're trying to prep them for pre-polish, and you've gone through 2 or 3 different grits of sanding medium already, and you carelessly pick up some debris out of your bench that wasn't cleaned up from earlier, and you end up scratching the pieces that you're trying to prep, and you've got to start all over again. So by getting yourself in the habit of doing that as you go, you're less likely to run into those kind of scenarios. So here you can see we've got the polish gone all the way ready for like a Tripoli compound, which is a relatively aggressive cutting compound, like, rouge would be a compound for polishing, on that one edge. So what we're going to do on the rest of this piece is we're going to do all 4 edges. We're going to do the back, and we'll do the front to a level of probably satin finish. So it would be a very fine sanding all in one direction with no scratches in the opposite direction, and it'll give it a kind of satin finish before we go and finish the bale and mount the bale to the piece, particularly on that one corner, on that one edge, at minimum. And the reason for that is once we solder our bales on, our bale mechanisms on, and our accent pieces, you can imagine how hard it would be to try and get into this little corner down here and make this high polished, shiny surface with this piece in the way. That's going to be very difficult to do. So by doing the preparation, you prep the surface to a pre-polish, or even in some cases a polished finish before you move on to the next step, will make it that much easier to clean up after you're finished with the soldering, and get it closer to that finished surface condition that you're shooting for. So we're going to set this piece aside, and like I said, we'll finish these other surfaces off stream. And so now we want to move on to working on the bale mechanism. So in our last stream, we formed these out of the stock material. We had 2 different sizes of square wire and some flat plate. And we used the square wire to cut out these little square design elements, accent pieces, and we used a strip of that flat plate to make the bale. We cut and formed the channels for the bend for the 45-degree joint, miter joint, on the 4 corners of both the bale mechanism and the bale itself. And then we went back and soldered those joints with a medium silver solder. So today what we're going to do is we're going to finish the rough shaping of these pieces, and then we'll pre-finish them with the files and abrasive medium in preparation for pre-polishing, and what we'll do is pre-fit them to the piece, make sure that the angles are what we need them to be and the finished shape is consistent with what we were shooting for. And we'll do that on stream today. So let's go ahead and start with the bale mechanism. So after we soldered the 2 corners of it, we used our parallel pliers to kind of square everything up just by grabbing the piece and giving the jaws a nice squeeze. Silver is soft enough that it will bend very easily. So on the one hand, that's good, but you still want to be careful in handling it so you don't bend it more than you want it bent. So you can see that after the soldering step on both of these joints here and here, that you have a little bit of buildup, and that's where you've got a high spot where the solder, when it went from solid to liquid and it wicked up through that joint, it pooled up a little bit on the surface before it solidified. And you'll get that solder buildup depending upon how much solder you use, either to a greater or lesser degree, by the size of the solder that you've cut to be soldered in place. So having a small piece of solder to solder this joint means I have less buildup to remove afterwards. And this side here had a little bit more solder, so there's a little bit more buildup that needs to be removed. But what we want to do is we want to square this piece back off and redefine the angle that the piece needs to be. So what I'm using now is I'm just using my coarse file, and I'm flattening the top surface. And then I'll come back and I'll do that on both of the legs as well. Again, filing in one direction, making a few passes, looking at the piece to see if all of my if all of the teeth are cutting in the same direction, or if there's any cross gouges or nicks or divots in the metal that I have to file down to make it flat again. And I'll do that on the 3 outer edges. So the outer edge of the top of the mechanism and the 2 legs themselves. And then when that looks good, take that sharp edge off of the corner. Then I will take the piece and just lay it on the face of the file flat, take my finger and put my finger on top of it, and just first, until you get the hang of it, just put enough pressure on it that you can hold it on, but not so much pressure that it does any cutting at all, and just slide it back and forth across the top of the file. And it's not doing any cutting, it's just riding across the top of that. And so rather than put my finger on it and try and push down, because now the teeth have grabbed and it's going to jump as soon as I try to put a forward motion on this, and it could flip the piece over. I could end up filing off a corner I don't want to file off. It could end up damaging the piece, because like I said, silver is very soft. It bends really easy. And then I've done all that damage I don't want to do. So by putting my finger on top of it and sliding it back and forth, I know that it's on there and I have control of it. And now I can begin to apply just a little bit of pressure. And see, as soon as I did that, it jumped out from underneath my finger. Did you see that? Now, if I had been putting a lot of pressure on that, it would have rolled the metal and damaged the metal as it jumped out up from underneath my finger. So again, you want to have just a light pressure, and it begins to cut. And so now you see on 3 of those corners the shiny spots, right, where the metal is being cut away, and that's those high parts of that solder, and that one leading end where it was cut, this end over here, where it was cut, and the deformation that was caused by the side cutters squeezing the metal before it clipped off created a high spot. So that high spot there, these two high spots are beginning to file down. And as you can see, they're a different surface condition. They look slightly different in the camera. They look dark, but actually that's the light reflecting off. And the other sections are dull because that's the way the metal looked after we did the soldering. So it's kind of like under the microscope, it looks like an orange rind, and that's what they call that surface. That's the surface of gold and silver, for that matter. When you heat it, particularly during a welding or soldering step, where just the surface has begun to melt a little bit and take on that kind of mottled surface condition, like the rind of an orange. So from a distance, that orange looks nice, orange color, and for all you know, it could be a glassy, smooth surface. You don't know. It's too far away. But as you get closer, you start to see that the surface of an orange is kind of rough, and that's what they call that orange peel. So anyways, back to the filing. So again, I'll put my finger on top with just enough pressure to keep the part there, and then I'll slide it back and forth. And then as I do that, I begin to apply more and more pressure, and I can feel the teeth cutting into the metal. So now I turn it over. Let's see if we can get that light again. There we go. So now you can see that it's cutting all the way along this one side. So what that tells me is that I want to apply a little bit more pressure on the opposite side so that the file begins to cut there equally, so that the face of it will be flat. One side won't be filed thinner than the other. So by applying just a little bit of a forward pressure with my finger to this already lightly pressured piece, I can get the file to cut a little bit more equally along those two surfaces. Ultimately, we wanted to cut all three of these surfaces, both legs and the top, equally. So now you can see there's only one little section left over here that has that, in the little tiny part on this side, that have that orange peel surface where the file hasn't gotten down to it yet. So we know that just a couple more passes on the file will make that metal flat on all three sides equally. So now I can see just the inside surface had just a little orange peel. So we can live with that because those edges are going to be slightly rounded when we've pre-polished this anyways, or pre-finished it. They're going to be a slightly rounded edge. But when you move this piece in the light, it's not a very good way of doing that. You can see almost all the scratches go in one direction. I don't see any more of that orange peel. It's beginning to reflect the light now as opposed to absorb it like that satin finish orange peel did. This is reflecting the light. So we know that stage of the sanding is complete. So now, before we move on, we're going to flip the piece over, and we're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Again, light pressure, just enough to hold it. Slide it back and forth until it moves really easy, and then begin to put a little bit of pressure, and you can hear it start to cut. And make a few passes, turn it over, take a look at it, see which parts need more or less pressure, so that at the end I get equal cut on all three faces of the top and the two legs. And then I can go and we can file the inside edges, which is a little bit more challenging in that most of these hand files that we're using obviously are too big to get into that space. So we'll have to use some of our needle files to get in there. Great. All right. So that's that face. Now I want to use my next grit or my next cut of file, and again file in one direction and look to see if the scratches from the previous step are still there. Then change the direction and file so that all of the scratches go in one direction and you can't see any scratches from the previous step. And as you go, you'll begin to develop a feel for how each file cuts, what pressure is enough pressure, what pressure is too much, and you can develop a sense of feel for those steps. As you do more and more pieces, you'll become more and more comfortable with and familiar with the way that feels as you're filing a piece. So now I'm looking through my files for an equaling file, or you can use just the standard square. But what I like about the equaling file is it has a longer face on one side and a smaller cutting face on the other. And what that does is it allows me to lay the file square along the leg and use the bottom cutting surface to cut into the solder joint at the bottom of that joint, or the bottom of that bail. And the longer face lets me keep it square to the leg so that I don't end up cutting into that solder joint at an angle and then having to come back and fix that because I ended up removing more metal than I cared to. So now I'm going to look for, I'm just going to use these here. You can use a clamping plier or actually any kind of locking vise or pair of pliers. But I like these locking pliers, like little vise pliers, because they'll hold the piece really steady. And I can get in and do the work that I want to do without risking bending the piece too much before I'm ready. Well, if in fact I want to bend it. I may not want to bend it at all. So what the pliers does is that lets me hold the piece with less risk of bending than would be the case if I tried to do it with just my fingers. So I'm using the needle file now to square off the inside corners, because when the solder flows, it becomes liquid, and as liquid tends to want to do, it wicks up the surface that it's riding along, and when it's turned hard, cooled, you had a rounded surface instead of a nice square corner. Where that solder wicked up both sides, it now made a radius. So I want to remove that solder from that corner joint to make it square again. And you can do that by filing from two different directions again, and removing little bits of material until you see all of your cuts, scratches, equally across the face of the piece with each pass. Then you know that your surface is flat. Now, it's not going to be shiny yet because this is a relatively rough file surface, but it's going to be a whole lot easier for me to go in and clean this off and have it still remain relatively square and sharp than if I left that buildup in there and tried to come in with some other kind of a polishing medium. It would be a rounded, the rounded corners at best, and sloppy looking at worst. So what the files do is they allow me to kind of refine that shape in a small area with these little needle files. So now that we have that prepped, I'm going to look at a couple of things. So this is how the bail is going to mount inside of this mechanism, and then the pendant will be soldered onto the bottom part here. So the bail is going to have a little bit of room to move up and down, and just a little bit of room to move side to side, so that it can rock freely and allow the pendant to dangle freely, not get bound up. If that space is too tight, it'll get bound up and it won't want to hang well. So I'll pre-fit it and make sure everything looks good. And then once I know that it does, and I want to finish it a little bit more, I can take one of my sandpaper discs and use the narrow surface as opposed to the wide surface, and just walk that across the top of the piece and begin the sanding off those previous tool marks, file marks, scratches from the previous step. And it can show me by highlighting any areas where the bail, if it fit too tight or if it was wedged in there, it would leave a mark. And I'd be able to see that as I begin to sand this these faces down with the sandpaper stick. And again, using it to highlight the previous steps, tool marks, if any, as well as I can use it to refine the shape a little bit more, particularly if I want to have an equal amount of material removed if I'm breaking a sharp edge. And as you can see, this edge is smooth and rounded, and that happened as a result of the previous sanding and filing step, where this side is still very sharp, and I haven't removed as much on that corner. So I can use this sanding stick to remove just little bits of metal and make that corner smooth and not sharp anymore. And now, okay, so now I'll go to a smoother grit. Is that it? And we'll do, again, repeat the process, sanding through the scratches from the previous step. I'm changing the direction and seeing if all those scratches are equal. And do the other side, same thing. And the top and the sides. Yeah. All right. So it's all prepped pretty well. Now let's see. One thing I want to do is I want to bring these legs in a little bit. Okay. All right. Okay. So that looks pretty close. And let me put that next to, okay, so this is going on here. Go along the top, and yeah, that looks good. All right, so now we'll move on to the next part, which is the bail. And first thing I want to do is square up one of the surfaces. So these pieces are the outer surfaces. We want to remain as flat as they were in the rolled material. So I don't want to mess with those right now, other than what we'll do is we'll come back in and clean up the little bit of solder buildup that it has on the joints. Other than that, we don't want to mess with those surfaces. So I want to make sure all the sides are equal. So we do that by establishing one flat surface on the side. And the easiest, that's way too rough. Easiest way to do that is to use a flat equaling file. And again, placing the piece on the file, putting your finger on it and applying just enough pressure to hold it in place. Now, on a piece like this where it's long and narrow relatively, sometimes what I'll do is I'll use the pads of both of my fingers on both ends so that I have equal pressure so that it doesn't rock. If I lay my finger pad across it, it's a whole lot harder to control as I try to move it back and forth than if I use the pads of my fingers to hold it and then drag it just with enough force to keep it flat, but not any downward force at all. And you see, it wants to jump out of my fingers. Okay, so again, pads of my fingers, front and back, and just enough force to hold it flat. And I'm drawing it in one direction this way because I still have it. I have it held between my fingers. And you can see there's shiny and not shiny again from the cut. And I want to draw it cutting in one direction as I'm drawing it towards me. And just enough pressure to keep it flat, but not so much that it binds up. And then pressure to the front or back, kind of rocking it back and forth with my fingers with slight pressure on one side as opposed to the other, and checking it after each couple of cuts to see where that file is cutting the most so that I can adjust the pressure to equalize the cut across all three faces of the piece. Yes. And once I do that, I'll know that that side, all three faces are flat. They're equal, and they're flat in relation to each other, as well as across the face of each piece. So that's my starting point for this piece. I want to make sure that those surfaces are square, and then I can square all the other surfaces relative to that face and end up with a equally square piece, or the surfaces are equally square to each other. Okay, so now that I have that one side, I can flip it over, and now I have a flat surface, a flatter surface for my fingers to rest on, and it's easier to control now as I'm sliding it back and forth across the file than before I had that one side squared. It was very hard to hold and control as I drew it across the file, and it wanted to jump out from my fingers. Now it's a whole lot easier to maneuver along the face of the file and let the file do its job of cutting material. So there we go. So now I'll use the file on one of the faces, and I'm placing it flat relative to the little bump that was created by the solder, and I want to ride the file basically so that it cuts just through that bump and not much into the face of the metal. I want the bump to be gone, but I don't want to remove a lot of metal from the face of the piece. I just want the solder to go away, or the ridge that's created sometimes during the soldering step when the solder goes back from liquid to solid. And I just want that bump to go away. So if you can see the lights reflecting off of the cut along this face and the bump of the solder on the opposite side. And I want that bump to go down enough so that the face of the piece will ride equally across the file. And there, we're almost there. We've got just a little bit of the rough surface, the soldered surface on that leg, and I can live with that for now because the majority of that piece is completely flat from the file. You've got just this one section across here where it is slightly lower. So the next few steps will go down through that material. So like I said, I can live with that. That, and then okay. Great. So now we have both the bail mechanism and the bail itself finished, shaped. So we've got the basic dimensions where we want them to be. We've got the faces of the pieces relatively finished, so high spots are removed, deep cuts and gouges have been sanded out in preparation for the next step, which will be pre-finishing. So we will be using some other abrasive medium on a rotary tool. So we'll be using sanding discs of different courses on these little split mandrels, and then we'll be mounting those in our flex shaft and using this rotary tool to do the sanding work that the sanding sticks did on the larger flat pieces. So these take a little bit more delicate of a touch to use because they're easy to get off plane or not square and end up rounding off edges that we don't want rounded off. So we'll be using those tools as well as some of the needle files to do the pre-finishing or the pre-shaping, forming of the insides and then prepping the outside surfaces in preparation for the pre-fitting of the bail mechanism, the two accent pieces, and the final plate, or the final arm of the bail that goes across the bottom, the plate. Prepping those pieces to be soldered to the pendant, and then the bail attached and the parts pre-polished, and then final polish when the piece is completely assembled and all the preparations are done. So that will be the next. So I gotta figure out a way to. I like that light, but I don't like that. Yeah, that's not bad. So that'll be in our next. That'll be next time, and we will take the next steps on the fabrication and finishing of this pendant. And we'll talk about the tools that we use, why we use the tools that we use, some of the benefits that we can get by modifying some of our existing tools or upgrading to a new tool, if in fact that's what we want to do. That can aid us in our quest to learn the manufacturing arts in specific gold and silver smithing. So until next time, thanks for joining me. I hope you got something out of this video, and I hope you get a chance to join us next time. Until then, thanks for coming on. I noticed that there were a couple of questions in chat. This piece, to answer Josh's question, or to answer Captain's question, is a stylized pendant in the style of Frank Lloyd Wright. The symbol, that kind of a alternating wheel type of symbol, is in the style of Frank Lloyd Wright. We talked about him a little bit in the last stream as an American architect, and he had a home that he built called Taliesin that had these symbols throughout the construction of the home, and it became very popular in the 1930s and 40s, and he rose to worldwide fame in his architectural design and his construction. So, again, thanks for joining. Hope you guys take something away from this. And again, if there's any questions, feel free to reach out. You can email me. You can reach me on YouTube, or feel free to join in chat and ask your questions. And until next time, thanks for coming. Bye.